"I'm freezing, can I get in please, I beg you," said the desperate Apache woman to the cowboy. The wind howled across the open plains, slicing through the thin layers of clothing that the young Apache woman wore. Each gust seemed to carry with it the sharp taste of ice and snow, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Her hands, red and stiff from the cold, shook as she clutched her thin blanket closer around her shoulders. Every step she took through the deep snow was a battle. Each foot sank into the drifts, forcing her to lift it painfully out again. Her body ached from the cold, from hunger, and from exhaustion. She had been running for hours, or maybe days. She had lost track of time in the blinding whiteness of the storm. Her mind was consumed by one thought: survival. She had to survive. Her journey had not begun with the snow. Days ago, her life had been filled with the sounds of her family's voices, the warmth of the campfire, and the familiar sights of her people's village. But all that had been shattered. Violence had come to her home when she least expected it. A rival group had attacked her camp in the dead of night. She remembered waking to the screams, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the desperate shouts of her kin. Chaos had filled the darkness, and she had run blindly, trying to save herself as others fell around her. She had no weapon, no plan, only a raw instinct to keep moving, keep breathing, keep surviving. The landscape had changed as she fled. She had left the forested hills where her people had lived for generations and had entered the open plains, where nothing stood between her and the fierce winter. The snow had begun lightly at first, a gentle powder that tickled her face. Soon it turned heavy and unrelenting, and now the ground was covered in thick white layers. The wind whipped across the plains with a force she had never experienced before, and she felt the cold creeping under her blanket, into her clothes, and even into her bones. She was starving, her stomach growled with a pain that made her knees weak. She tried to push it aside, tried to focus on her path, but the ache was constant, gnawing at her. Hours passed, or was it days? She could not tell. Every time she thought she saw something in the distance, a tree, a rock, a shelter, it would vanish when she blinked, swallowed by the swirling snow. She stumbled over hidden obstacles, scraping her arms and legs, cutting her hands on frozen branches. Her feet were numb, and she wondered if she would ever feel them again. The world around her had become a blur of white, a vast expanse where no human life seemed possible. She whispered prayers under her breath, speaking to the spirits of her ancestors, asking for strength, for guidance, for mercy. Her voice was weak, almost carried away by the wind, but she could not stop. Suddenly she thought she saw a shape in the distance, a small structure that broke the endless whiteness. Could it be a cabin, a house? Her heart leapt. She did not know who might live there. Perhaps it was empty, perhaps it was dangerous, but she had no choice. She could not survive another night out here. She forced her frozen legs to move faster, stumbling and sliding through the snowdrifts. Each step was agony, but the sight of shelter, even a tiny one, gave her hope. As she drew closer, she noticed the faint glow of light from a window. Her heart raced, a mix of fear and desperation. She knew she had to try. She approached the cabin, her voice trembling as she called out, "Please, please, I am freezing, can I get in?" The words came out as a hoarse whisper, carried weakly by the wind. She begged louder, adding, "I beg you. I cannot stay out here any longer." Her hands shook so badly she could barely knock on the door. Inside the cabin, a cowboy sat by a small fire. He was a solitary man, used to the harshness of frontier life. He had learned long ago to trust only himself and to be cautious of strangers. The wind outside rattled the cabin walls, and he could hear faint cries carried by the storm. At first, he ignored them, assuming it was just the wind or some animal lost in the snow. But the cries continued, human and desperate. He rose slowly, stepping to the window, peering through the frost to see a figure struggling through the snow. A woman. She looked small and frail against the vast whiteness, her face red from the cold, her eyes wide with fear. He hesitated. His first thought was caution. The frontier was dangerous. Strangers could be threats. His hand hovered near the rifle in the corner, an instinct he had learned to rely on. But as he watched her struggle, shivering uncontrollably, he felt something else stirring in his chest: compassion. The desperation in her eyes, the trembling of her body, and the pleading in her voice touched something deep inside him. He could not turn her away into that storm. With a deep breath, he opened the door just enough to speak, his voice firm but kind. "Come in, quickly." The woman stumbled forward, too weak to move gracefully, and the cowboy reached out, steadying her. She shivered violently as she crossed the threshold. and he closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind and the snow. The warmth of the small cabin was almost unbearable after the icy cold, and tears began to form in her eyes. She could not believe she was safe, even for a moment. The cowboy led her to the fire and offered her a blanket. She sank to the floor, wrapping it tightly around herself, feeling the warmth slowly creeping into her frozen body. She could barely speak, but she managed to whisper, thank you so much." Her voice was hoarse, but it was filled with gratitude that went beyond words. He nodded silently, sitting across from her, watching as she tried to regain some strength. The cowboy studied her carefully. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair matted from the snow and wind. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her lips cracked from the cold. He noticed a small knife at her side, worn but functional, likely carried for survival rather than harm. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and trust, unsure if he would turn her away or help her further. He chose to help. It was the right thing to do. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. The woman slowly began to feel her frozen fingers, rubbing them together to bring back circulation. The warmth seeped into her legs, her arms, and her chest. Her teeth stopped chattering as violently, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The cowboy poured some water into a cup and offered her a small piece of bread. She accepted it with trembling hands, biting slowly, savoring each crumb as if it were a feast. As she ate, she began to speak in a quiet voice, telling him fragments of her story. She had fled her village after a sudden attack. Her family had been scattered. She had no idea who was alive or dead. She had run through forests, across hills, and finally onto the plains, chased by snow and fear alike. Each word was filled with pain, but also with survival instinct. The cowboy listened, silently letting her speak. He did not interrupt, for he knew the importance of letting someone unload their burden after such trauma. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was hard to tell. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the cabin became a sanctuary. The woman's breathing slowed, her body warmed, and her mind began to relax just a little. She felt safe, and that safety was almost unfamiliar after days of terror and exposure. The cowboy could not erase what had happened to her, but he could offer shelter, warmth, and human kindness. And in this simple act, a fragile bond began to form between them, two people from different worlds, brought together by chance, snow, and desperation. The night grew long, but neither of them slept immediately. They sat near the fire, the woman wrapped in blankets, the cowboy keeping watch. Outside, the wind screamed and snow drifted against the cabin walls, but inside there was a fragile peace. The woman's lips moved in silent prayer, gratitude mingling with fear that tomorrow would bring more hardship. The cowboy remained quiet, knowing that sometimes words were unnecessary. Their shared presence, the warmth, and the unspoken understanding were enough for now. By the early hours of the morning, the woman's shivering had stopped. Her skin had regained some color, her eyes shone with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She looked at the cowboy, eyes filled with unspoken questions. Would he help her further? Could she trust him? He offered a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that for now she was safe. And in that moment, surrounded by the harsh winter outside and the fragile warmth inside, hope returned to her heart. Hope that perhaps she could survive, perhaps she could find her family, perhaps she could live another day. The cabin was small, with walls made of roughly hewn logs and a roof that creaked under the weight of the snow. Inside, the fire crackled, sending warmth and a soft orange glow across the room. The Apache woman huddled near it, her thin blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her body still shivering occasionally as it adjusted to the sudden warmth. The cowboy moved around the cabin quietly, stacking more wood on the fire, filling a small kettle with water, and setting out a few supplies he had left from his own meager store. At first, there was a silence between them. The woman, exhausted and wary, did not speak much. She looked around the cabin, her dark eyes taking in the sparse furnishings. A simple bed, a wooden table, a few chairs, and the tools of a life lived alone in the wilderness. The cowboy watched her from across the room. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched slightly whenever he moved. It was natural, he thought. She had been running for days, had seen death and violence, and had survived in the snow. Trust did not come easily after all that. The cowboy approached slowly, speaking in a calm, measured voice. "You must be hungry," he said. "Here, eat something." He handed her a small plate of bread and some dried meat. She hesitated at first, glancing at him as if unsure whether he might harm her, but hunger overcame fear. She took the food with trembling hands and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. Her hands shook so violently that a few crumbs fell to the floor. The cowboy bent down quickly to sweep them aside, careful not to frighten her. As she ate, he studied her quietly. She was young, but her face carried the weight of experience far beyond her years. There were bruises and scratches on her arms and legs, the result of her escape through the frozen wilderness. Her clothes were thin and ragged, barely protecting her from the cold, and her hair was matted with ice and snow. He noticed a small knife at her waist, its edge dulled by use. It was a weapon, yes, but more likely a tool for survival than for attack. She finally looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. I ran my camp, they attacked family." Her words tumbled out in broken English, each one heavy with pain and exhaustion. She tried to continue, but tears filled her eyes and her voice faltered. The cowboy nodded silently, letting her speak. He did not interrupt. He knew she needed to tell someone, to let her story be heard, even in fragments. The fire popped suddenly, sending a small spark into the air. The woman flinched and pulled the blanket tighter around her. The cowboy reached out, gently touching her hand to reassure her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You are safe here, nobody will hurt you." His words seemed to reach her, and she nodded slowly, though her eyes still carried fear. It would take time for her to fully believe him, and he understood that. Trust was not something given lightly, especially after all she had endured. Over the next hour, the cowboy moved around the cabin, preparing more food and tending the fire. He brought a small bowl of warm water for her to wash her face and hands, and she accepted it hesitantly, marveling at the simple comfort. She had not felt such warmth in days, not since she had left the chaos of her village. Every small act of kindness, bread, warmth, fire, water, felt monumental after the hardships she had endured. Slowly, she began to speak more clearly. She told him about the attack on her camp. "They came at night, so many fire, shouting, running, I could not." Her words were interrupted by sobs, but the cowboy did not flinch. He offered her a small cloth to wipe her tears. "It's all right," he said gently. "You don't have to hide your pain here." She spoke of her family with a mixture of love and sorrow. Her younger siblings, her parents, her grandparents, she remembered them all vividly. She spoke of the laughter around the campfires, of songs and stories told under the stars, of the traditions her people had passed down through generations. And then she spoke of the chaos and terror, of how quickly it had all been taken away. Her voice broke as she admitted she had no idea if anyone had survived. The cowboy listened in silence. He could not imagine the terror of losing one's entire family, let alone being alone in the frozen wilderness. He understood fear, loneliness, and hardship, but her story carried a weight that pressed heavily even on his own hardened heart. Yet in listening, he realized that sometimes the best help one could give was simply to hear the pain of another person without judgment, without interference, without fear. As the night deepened, he offered her more blankets, helping her layer them over her shivering frame. He brought a small cup of hot broth and encouraged her to drink slowly. She obeyed, feeling the warmth fill her stomach and seep into her frozen body. Every sip seemed to strengthen her, not just physically, but emotionally. She felt for the first time in days that someone truly cared for her survival. Outside, the wind howled and snow swirled in white clouds, but inside, the cabin felt almost safe. The woman's fear did not disappear, but it began to lessen. She glanced at the cowboy, studying his face, trying to understand his intentions. He met her gaze evenly, showing no malice, only concern. Slowly, she began to believe that he meant what he said, that she was safe, at least for now. Time passed, and the woman began to move a little more freely. She sat on the floor near the fire, her blanket wrapped around her, and started to talk about her life before the attack. She described the songs her people sang, the dances performed during festivals, the way her community had worked together to survive the harsh conditions of their land. She spoke with pride and nostalgia, her voice soft but filled with life, and the cowboy listened, fascinated by the richness of her experiences. He began to share some of his own story as well, though carefully. He told her about living alone in the wilderness, about the hardships of hunting, building, and surviving the winter storms. He spoke of his own losses, the friends and family he had buried or lost to disease, accident, or violence. He did not want to make her feel burdened, But he also wanted to show her that he understood loss and survival, that they were not so different in that respect. A fragile bond began to grow between them. It was built on mutual recognition of hardship, on shared humanity, and on the small, everyday acts of care that slowly knit them together. The cowboy's caution softened, replaced by a quiet empathy. The woman's fear, while not gone, became mixed with gratitude and a tentative trust. She realized that this man, a stranger in the wilderness, had saved her life by offering shelter, warmth, and understanding. But the world outside the cabin remained harsh and unforgiving. The snowstorm showed no signs of letting up, and the surrounding settlement was distant and wary of outsiders. Rumors could easily reach ears that would misunderstand, and neighbors might question the presence of a lone Apache woman. The cowboy knew this, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He had seen too much suffering to turn someone away because others might judge. Through the night, the woman gradually regained some of her strength. She moved closer to the fire, feeling warmth in her legs and torso. She began to speak more freely, recounting small details about her life, her culture, her journey, and her fears. The cowboy listened patiently, occasionally asking gentle questions to help her tell her story. Each exchange deepened their understanding of one another, building a sense of trust that neither had expected so quickly. By the time dawn approached, the storm outside had begun to subside slightly. The wind still blew and snow covered the ground, but the worst had passed. The woman, now wrapped in multiple blankets, felt a cautious hope stirring within her. She had survived the night, thanks to the kindness of a stranger. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel a small sense of relief, even gratitude. She looked at the cowboy, her eyes filled with quiet emotion, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping me safe." The cowboy nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. He understood that the woman's journey was far from over and that dangers still lay ahead. Yet he also understood the importance of this moment, the creation of a safe space in a world that had offered little comfort or compassion. In the quiet cabin, warmed by the fire and shared humanity, both of them experienced a fragile, yet profound connection. And so, as the first light of morning began to filter through the frosted windows, the cowboy and the Apache woman remained near the fire. She rested, slowly regaining strength, while he watched over her, ready to help her continue her journey whenever she was ready. The bond of trust, hesitant but real, had begun to form. And in that small, snowbound cabin, amidst the harshness of winter and the hardships of frontier life, something remarkable was taking root. Compassion, understanding, and the first step toward survival together. The days after the storm were quiet but full of small, meaningful moments. The snow had begun to melt slowly, leaving patches of hard earth and frozen puddles on the plains. Outside, the wind had calmed, though occasional gusts still rattled the cabin walls. Inside, the Apache woman and the cowboy had settled into a tentative routine. She helped with simple chores, stacking firewood, filling water from a nearby stream, and keeping the cabin tidy. Though her body was still weary from the journey and the cold, each task strengthened her, giving her a sense of purpose and control that had been absent for so long. The cowboy, observing her, felt a quiet respect for her resilience. She had endured unimaginable hardships, fleeing from violence, surviving freezing temperatures, and walking alone through the wilderness. Her presence in his cabin was a reminder that life, even in its harshest forms, carried stories of courage and survival. He admired her strength, but he also recognized her vulnerability. She was not a warrior in this moment. She was a human being, seeking warmth, safety, and understanding. They began to talk more freely during these days. The Apache woman shared stories of her life before the attack. She spoke of the rolling hills where her people had lived, the clear rivers where they fished, and the forests where they gathered food and herbs. She described festivals filled with dancing, songs, and laughter, and told tales of elders who taught lessons about courage, kindness, and the spirits that guided their people. Her voice, once trembling and fearful, now carried warmth and pride. The cowboy listened intently, fascinated by her culture and the richness of her experiences. In return, he told her about life on the frontier. He spoke of the hardships he faced, hunting in the freezing cold, repairing his cabin before the storms arrived, and surviving days without company or comfort. He shared memories of friends and family who had been lost to sickness or accident, the pain of isolation, and the hard lessons that life in the wilderness had taught him. At first, he spoke carefully, revealing only what was necessary, but as the days passed, he grew more open, recognizing the importance of sharing and connection. Their conversations often stretched long into the evenings. They would sit by the fire, sipping warm broth or chewing dried meat, speaking quietly while the snow melted outside. The Apache woman who had once feared strangers began to trust him more. She asked questions about his life, his past, and his thoughts, and he answered honestly. With each shared story, the barrier between them slowly faded. The cabin, once merely a shelter from the storm, became a space of mutual understanding and comfort. Small acts of care continued to strengthen their bond. The cowboy tended to her frostbitten fingers, massaging them gently to restore circulation. He brought her additional blankets when he noticed she shivered, and he encouraged her to eat nourishing food even when her appetite was weak. Each gesture, simple as it seemed, carried profound meaning. For the Apache woman, these actions were proof that kindness could exist in a world that had often shown her only fear and cruelty. For the cowboy, each act of care was a reaffirmation of his belief in the power of human connection. Despite the growing trust between them, tension lingered outside the cabin. The small settlement nearby was wary of strangers, especially those from the Apache tribes. Rumors could spread quickly, and people might react out of fear or prejudice. The cowboy was aware of this, yet he refused to let it dictate his actions. He knew that turning the woman away or forcing her to leave would only add to her suffering. He had seen too much hardship to ignore someone in need, regardless of what others might think. As the days passed, the Apache woman's body regained strength, and her mind began to feel less burdened. She could move more freely, walk without assistance, and even help with heavier chores around the cabin. Yet her spirit was still haunted by the memories of the attack and the uncertainty of her family's fate. She would sometimes wake at night, gasping or crying softly, and the cowboy would be there to comfort her. He would offer a warm hand, a quiet word, or a reassuring presence, allowing her to release the fear that had built up over days of survival. Through these moments, vulnerability became a bridge between them. The Apache woman began to confide her deepest fears and regrets. She spoke of her guilt at leaving her family behind, the sorrow of witnessing violence, and the overwhelming loneliness that had followed. The cowboy listened without judgment, offering only empathy and understanding. He shared some of his own vulnerabilities as well, speaking of losses and regrets he had carried for years. In their shared openness, they found a rare and precious connection. Their bond was not just emotional but also practical. The cowboy taught her small survival skills that she could use when she eventually left. He showed her how to track footprints in the snow, how to find edible plants near the streams, and how to protect herself from sudden storms. In return, she shared knowledge of her people's ways, how to read signs in nature, find water in unlikely places, and use herbs for minor injuries. Their mutual exchange of skills deepened their respect for each other, turning trust into a partnership, however temporary. Laughter, though rare at first, began to enter the cabin. They would share small jokes, recount amusing incidents from the past, or laugh at mistakes made during daily chores. For the Apache woman, laughter was a balm, a way to feel alive after days of fear and suffering. For the cowboy, it was a reminder that even in harsh conditions, moments of joy were possible. These shared moments of lightness strengthened their bond, giving them both hope and courage for the uncertain days ahead. The weather outside slowly improved, but the Apache woman knew that she could not remain in the cabin forever. The snow was melting, revealing the dangers and challenges of the plains. Frozen rivers, deep crevices, and hidden predators. Yet, despite the awareness of her need to move on, she felt conflicted. She had come to trust the cowboy, and the idea of leaving his protection was frightening. She had discovered safety, warmth, and understanding in a world that had offered little. Yet the pull of family, community, and survival urged her forward. The cowboy noticed her growing hesitation. He understood that her departure was inevitable, and he respected it. He did not press her to stay or attempt to change her mind. Instead, he focused on preparing her for the journey ahead, ensuring she had the strength, knowledge, and supplies to survive. He provided extra blankets, food, and guidance, sharing advice on where she might find shelter or how to navigate the landscape. His focus was not on keeping her close, but on empowering her to continue her journey safely. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the Apache woman finally spoke about her hopes for the future. She whispered of finding her family, of rejoining her people, and of rebuilding the life that had been torn apart. Her voice carried a mixture of fear, longing, and determination. The cowboy listened, offering encouragement and quiet support. He reminded her that she had already survived so much, and that her resilience and courage would carry her forward. As the days passed, their trust deepened into mutual respect and a sense of companionship. The Apache woman no longer flinched at sudden movements or feared the cowboy's intentions. She had learned that he was dependable, compassionate, and protective. Likewise, the cowboy admired her strength, intelligence, and perseverance. He recognized that despite the hardships she had endured, she maintained a spirit that was both gentle and unbreakable. In this period of quiet coexistence, they also began to share dreams and small plans for the future. The Apache woman spoke of the life she wished to reclaim, of traditions she wanted to continue, and of the hope she carried for her scattered family. The cowboy shared his own hopes, not grand ambitions, but simple desires for peace, safety, and the continuation of life in harmony with the land. In sharing these dreams, they found a rare sense of understanding and solidarity. Though danger still lurked in the world outside the cabin, inside, a fragile sense of normalcy had emerged. The Apache woman was no longer just a survivor of the storm. She was becoming a part of a shared story, a human connection forged in the face of hardship. The cowboy, too, was no longer just a solitary man. He had become a witness to courage, a protector, and a friend. Together, they navigated the delicate balance between vulnerability and strength, fear and hope, isolation and connection. By the end of this period, both recognized that their bond had grown into something rare and meaningful. It was not dependent on proximity or permanence, but on shared experiences, trust, and understanding. They had discovered that human connection could flourish even in the harshest environments, that compassion and empathy could overcome fear, and that courage was not just the ability to survive, but the willingness to care for another despite uncertainty. The Apache woman, though still planning her eventual journey to find her family, felt a sense of comfort she had not experienced in days. The cowboy, too, felt a quiet fulfillment, knowing that his actions had made a tangible difference in another person's life. And in the small, snowbound cabin, amidst the quiet of the slowly thawing plains, they found a rare and precious sense of companionship, one that would remain in their hearts even after their paths inevitably diverged. The snow had finally begun to melt completely, leaving muddy paths and patches of frozen earth across the plains. The sun shone weakly, casting a pale light over the land, revealing a world that was still harsh but livable. The Apache woman sat by the fire, wrapped in several blankets, her dark eyes reflecting both exhaustion and renewed strength. She had spent several days resting, regaining energy, and preparing for the next stage of her journey. Each day spent in the cabin had given her more confidence, more hope, and more trust, not just in the cowboy who had sheltered her, but in herself. The cowboy moved quietly around the cabin, checking the fire, packing extra provisions, and making sure everything she would need for travel was ready. He did not speak much, but his actions carried care and concern. Every bundle of food, every folded blanket, every piece of advice was a gift of preparation for a dangerous and uncertain journey ahead. Though he had grown attached to her presence, he understood that her path would lead her away, and he respected her need to continue. The bond they had formed was real, but it was also fragile, dependent on circumstance and survival. Early that morning, the Apache woman approached him, her hands wrapped tightly around a bundle of supplies. "I must go now," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She had made the decision days ago, but speaking it aloud made the reality undeniable. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of hope, fear, and gratitude. She wanted to find her family, to return to her people, but leaving the cabin and the safety of the cowboy's care was terrifying. The cowboy nodded, setting down a small bag he had prepared for her. "I know," he said, "and I will not stop you. You are strong and you can survive. But remember, you are not alone. You can carry what you've learned here and it will help you find your way." His voice was calm and steady, a reassurance she desperately needed. He had no illusions that the journey ahead would be easy, but he had seen her grow stronger over the past days. She could do this. They stepped outside together, The air was cold but no longer biting. The snow was wet and slushy beneath their feet, and the wind had softened to a gentle breeze. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a mixture of white patches, frozen earth, and muddy tracks. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. It was invigorating, and yet it reminded her of how vulnerable she was in the wide, open landscape. The cowboy stayed beside her, a steady presence, offering guidance and support until she was confident enough to continue alone. "I will try to find my family," she said quietly, almost to herself. Her eyes, dark and filled with determination, met his for a moment. "I will remember you and what you have done for me." Her voice broke slightly, the weight of gratitude and emotion almost too much to carry. The cowboy smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sadness in his expression. "I will remember you too," he replied. "You have shown me courage, strength, and trust. Take them with you and let them guide your path." He wanted to say more, to offer comfort for the loneliness that would follow, but he knew words could not capture the depth of what had passed between them. The silence between them spoke louder than any words could. Before she left, he handed her a small, simple item, a knife with a sharp edge, carefully maintained. "For protection and survival," he said. "Use it wisely and it will serve you well." She took it reverently, recognizing the thought and care behind the gift. It was more than a tool. It was a symbol of trust, respect, and the bond they had formed. She tucked it carefully into her clothing, a tangible reminder of the courage and guidance he had shared with her. As the Apache woman walked away from the cabin, she paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back. The cowboy stood by the doorway, tall and steady, watching her. She wanted to say more, to express every emotion she felt, the gratitude, the relief, the sadness, the hope. But words seemed inadequate. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture filled with meaning, and continued walking. Her footprints marked the melting snow, a trail that would fade over time, just as their shared moments would remain in memory. The journey ahead was not easy. The plains were vast, and dangers still existed, wild animals, sudden storms, and treacherous terrain. Yet she felt stronger, more capable, and more hopeful than when she had first arrived at the cabin. The cowboy's guidance, the warmth of the fire, and the lessons she had learned gave her confidence. She had survived the storm, and now she was ready to face the world again. As she walked, she remembered the nights by the fire, the conversations they had shared, and the small acts of care that had meant so much. She thought about the lessons he had taught her: how to find water, how to read the land, how to protect herself from danger. Each memory strengthened her, reminding her that she was not just surviving. She was learning, growing, and reclaiming her own power. The cowboy returned to the cabin after she disappeared into the distance. He stood at the doorway for a moment, gazing across the plains, reflecting on what had happened. The encounter had left an impression on him unlike any other. He had always lived a solitary life, shaped by hardship and independence, but helping the Apache woman had reminded him of the power of compassion and human connection. Even in the harshest conditions, he realized, kindness could make a real difference. Days passed and the cowboy returned to his routines, but the memory of the Apache woman lingered. He thought about her courage, her vulnerability, and her determination to survive and find her family. The snow melted further, and life on the plains returned to its slow rhythm, but the lessons of trust, compassion, and shared humanity remained with him. He understood that the world could be harsh and unforgiving, but that moments of connection and care could endure beyond time and distance. The Apache woman's journey continued across the plains. She moved carefully, using the skills and knowledge she had gained in the cabin. She found small streams to drink from, gathered edible plants, and avoided dangerous areas. Each day, she felt stronger and more capable. She remembered the cowboy's words and the small acts of kindness, and they guided her, giving her hope that she could reach her family and find safety. Along the way, she encountered small challenges: deep snow patches that had not yet melted, cold nights that required careful shelter, and wild animals that crossed her path. But with each challenge, she relied on the lessons learned and the courage she had discovered within herself. The knife the cowboy had given her proved useful, not as a weapon, but as a tool to clear obstacles, gather firewood, and ensure her survival. It became a symbol of resilience, trust, and the connection that had changed her life. Eventually, she began to see signs of civilization in the distance: smoke from distant fires, faint trails of human activity, and signs of other camps. Each sight brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. She did not know what awaited her, whether her family had survived, whether the people she encountered would be friendly, but she carried hope in her heart. The lessons, the strength, and the trust she had gained from the cowboy's care gave her the courage to move forward despite uncertainty. When she finally reached a place where her people might be, she paused, taking a deep breath. The journey had been long and difficult, and yet she had survived. She had learned that courage was not just about facing danger, but also about accepting help, trusting others, and persevering even when the world seemed impossible. The cowboy's cabin, the fire, the warmth, and the guidance had changed her path. She would never forget the man who had offered safety in the midst of a storm, and she would carry his lessons with her forever. Back at the cabin, the cowboy continued his quiet life, tending to his home and the land around him. He thought of her sometimes, wondering if she had found her family and if she was safe. The connection they had formed, brief yet profound, remained with him as a reminder of the fragile beauty of human kindness. Even in the isolation of the frontier, he had experienced something extraordinary, the opportunity to make a real difference in another person's life. The Apache woman, now stronger and moving with purpose, began the next chapter of her life. She knew the journey would not end with her family, and that life would continue to present challenges, but she also knew she had the strength, skills, and courage to face them. She would carry the memory of the cowboy and the small cabin in the snow, a testament to the power of compassion, trust, and human connection. And as she walked toward her uncertain future, her footprints marked the earth like faint reminders of survival, hope, and resilience. Though their paths had diverged, the shared moments of care, trust, and understanding remained a part of both their lives. A story of survival, compassion, and the human heart that endures even in the harshest conditions.